Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Cold Brews and Catholic Truths. My name is Sean Hussey. Thanks for joining me today. If you're a new visitor, if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell. This podcast, this channel is dedicated to spreading and defending the truth of Catholicism. So it's usually apologetics based. We're usually talking about what the church teaches and why, and giving a defense for what the church teaches. But this is a little bit different. Today we're going to be focusing on Catholic life more so than Catholic teaching. We're going to be talking about living the life of Catholicism, living the life of a disciple, not only believing the right things, but being obedient to Christ. So I'm really excited to share this episode with you. I have a good friend and guest with me today, Matt Faley. Matt Faley, thanks so much for coming to my home. Welcome to the podcast.
Sean, it's so good to be here.
So why don't we just start by allowing you to introduce yourself. I mean, I could read your bio if you'd like, but I think I'd rather have you just kind of introduce yourself, tell the listeners and the audience maybe just who you are, what you do, about your family, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Thanks again. So good to be here, Sean.
Yeah.
So, Sean, we kind of have these conversations like every week.
Yeah.
We're blessed to work in the same building, so it's nice to be able to do this on camera. But
That's right.
So I've been here in Indianapolis for 10 years,
Yeah.
and I'm the father of 3 beautiful, awesome kids, obviously a husband. I've been in ministry full-time for 12 years, and that's another story, how I got here and got to be in ministry for this long, but I love it, and I'm also a musician. That's also kind of how Sean and I know each other, singer-songwriter, and that's probably the gist of it.
Yeah, for those, I mean, I don't think I've ever shared explicitly on the podcast, that I work for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis at the Catholic Center, downtown Indianapolis. So that's how Matt and I got connected. We got connected 2017 when I moved here, working in youth and young adult ministry.
Yep.
And you were at the time the director of young adult and college campus ministry for the diocese.
For the last 10 years, I was, mainly 8 of those years, I was the director of a ministry we have called Indy Catholic, which is a ministry to 18 to 39-year-olds in the Archdiocese.
And prior to that, were you in Focus right before?
I was. So
Okay.
a few years out of college, I felt a call to start working in ministry full-time, and that's where I felt this very unique call, unique to me at that point in my life, because I didn't know I was ready to say yes to it, was to serve as a missionary on a college campus. And so I did that for 2 years with Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University Students in Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
What university were you at?
University of Illinois at Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm also, like Sean, Illinois, born and bred.
That's right.
Yeah.
We got a lot of things in common.
A lot of things in common.
And Illinois is more than Chicago, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Contrary to popular belief. Yes. We live downstate.
Yes.
For the people who live in Chicago. So I grew up in Peoria, Illinois. Yeah.
So you've been, you've been in the game a long time in terms of thinking about evangelization and discipleship and how to effectively do this, at the campus level, at the parish level, all these types of things.
Yes.
And so that's kind of be the focus of today's episode. We're going to be talking about creating a culture of evangelization and discipleship, both in the home with the family and then also in the parish as well. I've got a patron who supports this ministry. His name's Father Gabriel. And so thanks, Father Gabriel, and thanks to all my patrons. Thanks for suggesting this episode. But he was really interested in, I think, specifically in talking about creating a culture of discipleship, a culture of evangelization in the family, in the home, in the domestic church. So I definitely want to talk about that. But I thought as well, seeing as our roles and what we talk about all the time, it'd be great to also talk about what could this look like in a parish, or what's the ideal for this to look like in a parish. But before we get into that, maybe we should just start by talking about, evangelization and discipleship, talking about these terms. My title at the Archdiocese is the coordinator of evangelization and discipleship. But I think to many people they're either misunderstood terms or just unknown terms. And so maybe we could just start by talking about maybe what these things mean. So what is evangelization? What is discipleship?
Yeah.
Are they the same? Are they different?
I
How
think
do they work together?
they work together like vitally. They have to.
Yeah.
I mean, one can't go without the other. But I think it's important. You brought up a good point. I think there needs to be a simplification of what those two things are, because I think we're at a place in the church now where there's a real, authentic desire for us, for people, for lay people, for parishes, for families, whatever, to know what the heck those two things are. Like, we want to know, how do we create a culture? Well, how do we create a culture without knowing what those two things are? So I think we have spent maybe some displaced energy on trying to figure those things out. So, like, we talk about this a lot. Like, there's so many theories, there's so many books, there's so many discussions that could be had about what evangelization discipleship is. But when we do that, we displace ourselves from the actual work of living discipleship and evangelization. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
we
really,
spend so much time, like, in theoretical definitions.
Yeah,
we
want to know the answers.
Apply
yeah, we want to know
reality.
answers. How do we do it?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is we just go love. I mean, that's what discipleship and evangelization is. It's first being in love. It's having an encounter with the person of Jesus, being in love and following him so that he can reveal to us more our own heart and the heart for our brothers and sisters. And then evangelization then is inviting people into that love. So again, I think we see the witness of the first disciples.
Yeah.
Like, they had an encounter with Jesus. Jesus came to them face to face and said, "Come follow me."
Yeah.
What are you looking for? Come follow me. They had a decision. They said yes or no, and they said yes, and they followed. And it was in the following, it was in the growing in love that they learned how to live evangelization and discipleship. And within that, their heart grew to then invite other people into it.
I love that, inviting people. I love that for evangelization, inviting people into the love of Christ.
Right.
Because, I don't know if people listening have heard this, but, we talk about evangelization not being like something the church does, but like who she is. It's her deepest identity, as Pope Paul VI says. The essential mission of the church is evangelization. So it's not like one thing. But I like when I think about it with that definition, like, the church exists to invite people into the love of Jesus Christ. That makes a lot more sense to me. That's the reason. That's the reason that Jesus created the Catholic Church in a particular way, to invite people, invite all the nations into relationship with him. And the ordinary place to do that is in and through the church.
Yep.
So that's evangelization.
Yeah.
And then you said discipleship then is just living out, the ongoing living out of that relationship.
Yeah, and again, I think that can be an oversimplification, but I really think we sort of need that.
Yeah.
Because again, referring back to the disciples that have walked before us, it was really messy.
Yeah.
And our lives should be messy when we're living in that. It's like they were built up together as a group of a community, a group of friends, a group of followers of the Lord. They went out, and then they came back and sort of licked their wounds in community and said, like, man, this was really, really awesome. Like, the Holy Spirit was so alive in this moment. But also, I was not super great. Like, I didn't use the right words. I wasn't super tactful. But they came back, grew in community, and they kept walking with the people that were in their lives. And it was like a learned experience where, again, to bring the gospel to the nations, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And you start with the people that are immediately in front of you, the people that God has asked you to share.
Well, and I think evangelization, too, is not like... I think what's helpful in talking about these things together is evangelization isn't only that initial invitation into a life with Christ, or even my initial acceptance of Christ in my life, but it has to be ongoing.
Lifelong.
As a baptized Christian, I'm constantly, I feel like, re-evangelized.
Yes.
Like, the Lord, brings me back. Like, return to the Lord with your whole heart. Prophet Joel.
I love that. It's my favorite.
I mean, to me, evangelization itself is an ongoing renewal that the Lord wants to, do in our lives.
Absolutely.
And I think that's where discipleship and evangelization start to kind of really go hand in hand.
Quick story. I had a friend who went to confession with the priest and was talking about, like, man, just feeling a general sense of malaise in their spiritual life. Just like, man, I just don't really feel motivated. I'm having a hard time praying. And you know what he asked? He said, when was the last time you evangelized? When was the last time you shared the faith with someone? And like, that to me is a great example of, it's a lifelong process. You have to be re-evangelized. And I think in a lot of ways that happens in our life of discipleship. When we start to share the faith with others, we ourselves are brought back into that love, that relationship
Our faith
with
grows
Jesus.
when it's given away.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get to the practicals, like, okay, how do we create a culture where this is normal in the family? A culture where this is normal in the parish. I think often it's not. But before we get to that, let's maybe just start first by talking about the primacy of prayer.
Absolutely.
The importance of prayer in the work of evangelization. This link between holiness and mission that St. John Paul II talks about. Of course, the church has always emphasized that one cannot be without the other. And I know that it's tempting to get right into the practicals and talking about how do we do this, this apostolic work. But maybe we could pause and just talk about the significance of our prayer life, the significance of our interior life. So what role does prayer play in evangelization and discipleship?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Lord really, throughout Scripture, we hear things, being tied to the vine. I mean, it's absolutely vital for us to be people of prayer if we're going to talk about evangelization, discipleship.
Yeah.
I think we can't be like Jesus if we're not availing ourselves to the gift of Jesus in prayer. We think about it like that. So I often like to tell people 3 simple things about what prayer really is. Again, I think there's an overcomplication of what prayer is in the life of a Christian. So 3 things. First, St. Augustine said, prayer is nothing more than becoming a longing for God. So we hear, like, Jesus is on the cross, and what does he say? He says, I thirst. Like, he's showing, like, I thirst for you, I come, I long for you, I stand at the door and I knock.
Yeah.
I am here, waiting for you to be in communion with you. And we ourselves know we long to be in communion with God.
Right.
So all prayer is, from the beginning, is just bringing our longing to meet the longing of God. So we all have longings, desires.
Yeah.
Like, there's psalms, there's Taylor Swift songs. They're all rooted in a longing for communion. And so we go there in our prayer, uniting our longing with the longing of God. So that's where we start. The second thing is where we discover our deepest and truest identity. So I remember when I first came back to the church, I had a reversion. I was trying to meet God in prayer, and I started using words that I would never use, and they all ended in th, like Lord, let me saith the words you want, things like that. They weren't me, and I was like, this is how I thought I was supposed to pray, but God came to show me, like, there is a language of my heart that's unique to me.
Yeah.
Mother Teresa used to tell her sisters, hear your own name in the thirst of Jesus. And I think that is so profound. Hear your own name, like God is coming to speak to you very specifically.
Yeah.
So again, it's where our longing meets the longing of the Lord. It's where we find our deepest and truest identity. And then lastly, which I think this is most connected to evangelization, discipleship, it's where we discover our mission. It's where we discover our deepest calling. Again, referring to Mother Teresa, she would often say, you first meet the thirst of Jesus, and then he shows you how to find the thirst of him in the world and our brothers and sisters. So it's where we discover how it is that our specific callings, our gifts and charisms are to be used in the world. So that if we do not have that basis of prayer in our life, it's very challenging to live a life of mission because we don't know where we're coming from.
Yeah. We were talking about this before, Matt, but this, I haven't read this book. Have you read the book, The Soul of the Apostolate?
I have.
You've read it? Okay, good. So
Kick my butt.
So this is an article. I got this from an article, commenting on this book, and I think Saint Bernard explains this, but the book is by Dom Chautard, right?
Yeah.
But he's basically talking about the significance of the relationship between the interior life and the active life. And so Saint Bernard explains the balance using an interesting metaphor of the reservoir and the channel. He says, the channels let the water flow away and do not retain a drop. But the reservoir is first filled and then, without emptying itself, pours out its overflow, which is ever renewed. He says, we have many channels in the church today, St. Bernard added sadly, but very few reservoirs. And so this article goes on to say, like, the devil knows the value of the interior life, and he'll often grant the apostle or the disciple maybe a purely superficial success if he can only prevent him from making true progress in the interior life. So Dom Chautard calls these successes sapphire, and then wisely points out that the devil will gladly trade a few sapphires of the active life for the diamond of the interior life.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, what do you think about that?
So good. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I can't really say anything better than he said, but like, our prayer is always a reference to love and mercy, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're meeting that love and mercy, and you look out into the world, what people are longing for love and mercy without a connection to that diamond. We ourselves as people of the faith looking to be evangelizers, to be folks who are disciples of Jesus, we can so easily be caught up in those sapphires, because they feel good.
Right.
They feel good to us. It becomes self-referential. But without really the depth of a prayer life that's rooted in that diamond, then I don't know, the fullness of the mission is not really lived out.
I'm thinking about the story right now of Martha and Mary, and Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, and Martha, busy doing things. What Jesus criticizes is not necessarily the activity, the actor, but her being worried and distracted about many things.
Yep.
And I think if we try to do evangelization, try to live a life of discipleship without abiding in the presence of Jesus daily, it's going to start to be cause us anxiety, cause us worries. Even in trying to do all the right things in evangelization, we're not abiding with Christ as well, choosing that better part, then I think we might be doing these tasks that may or may not be good things, but they'll lack that foundation.
Absolutely.
That's necessary to hand on the life of Christ. As you started off by saying, evangelization is inviting someone into a life of Christ. So we have to be abiding in that life in order to invite somebody into it.
Absolutely.
All right, so that being said, Matt, let's talk about how to create a culture of discipleship, how to create a culture of evangelization within the family or within the home. I think the home it's the first place, it's the primary place for evangelization and discipleship. As I was thinking about this episode and talking with you last night, the question came to my mind is, do we think about the home as a place of mission? Do we think about the home as a mission field? I know it's easy to think about the home as a place of rest, which it is, but there's a balance there too, because the home itself has to be a place of mission because it's where families are. It's where kids grow up. And if there's not a culture there of evangelization, it's not a culture of discipleship where that's normal, I think it's going to be really difficult, impossible maybe, to effectively hand on the faith to the next generation, to really create a culture of Christianity just around our country.
Absolutely.
And around the world. I mean, it's got to start in the family. We have a sign right downstairs from Mother Teresa quotes. I think it's, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family.
Gosh, I love that quote.
And so, this is what Father Gabriel, I think, was recognizing and mentioning when he kind of suggested this is something to talk about, creating a culture of evangelization and discipleship in the home. So I guess with that being said, let's start just by talking about what role does the family, maybe expound upon what I've started to say. What role does the family play in evangelization, in the work of evangelization and discipleship?
Yeah, and I'm speaking mainly from my own life, but I think in general terms, I think it can be relatable to kind of every family. And so, I mentioned at the beginning how often and easy it is for us to talk about theories of evangelization and discipleship. What's beautiful about the family is that you have no choice but to love. You know what I mean? I know you have a choice to not love, but you are living discipleship. You are living it because you are all together, and the freedom of family is that you have to choose to love. You like, as a single guy, you and I, like, we could choose to be living a life of discipleship, but once we got married, it was like we have people in our lives now. We have a mission that we cannot avoid. They're here, and God has asked us to do it. And that's the beauty of it. That's the freedom. The freedom is that we have one singular choice, is to get our family to heaven. So that, to me, it almost answers the question for us about how do we live discipleship and evangelization. You love the Lord and you love the family. And that's where change happens.
Yeah.
But I think what's beautiful about it, I think anecdotally in my own life, and I think, again, can be sort of shared generally, is that the way we come to love the Lord is almost in secret. Like, you and I now, as fathers, as husbands, we have experiences of loving God through our family in ways that nobody will ever see except ourselves. God comes to form us in these moments, in the intimacy of family life, so that we can then go out into the world and not only help our families get to heaven, but bring other people into that. So I'll give you an example. So I have 3 kids, like I said, and so I remember as a new dad, our oldest daughter, Birdie, was like, we found that the age of 2 has always been like where all this change happens. Like they're starting to see the world, they're starting to become more fearful because they're more aware of their surroundings. Mm-hmm. So like bedtime was the hardest thing for us for like 3 straight months. And so one night, this was like a 4-hour ordeal. I'm trying to help her get to bed. So I start as like super patient dad. I'm like, okay, let's just get to bed. And then I start as like, okay, I'm just going to shut the door and let her figure it out. And like, that's an hour and a half. It didn't work. So I'm in there, I'm losing my patience. And I'm like, okay, after about hour 4, I'm like, I'm just going to lay down. I'm going to pray the rosary next to her crib, right? So I start praying the rosary. After about the 3rd Hail Mary, I see this little hand come out of the crib. And she wants me to hold her hand.
Oh my gosh.
So I hold her hand. I'm just a blubbering mess.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my gosh. Like in that moment.
Your daughter especially.
Yeah. In that moment, God came to show me like the sacrificial love of a father, but also I have that moment now to like grow me as a disciple of Jesus forever. So we have this. So we have a basis, right? Of like the family is at center point of evangelization because we are choosing to love.
Yeah.
We're getting messy.
Yeah.
And then it's like God comes to form us in those moments. But then the last piece is like we have to open the doors to our family, to our domestic church. So I was at a wedding once, and the priest said, okay, you married couple, at this point, from here on out, your job is to open the doors to the cathedral of your life and invite people in. And I think that imagery is so powerful, you know, as a family. Because you think about it, like you go to Rome, you look around, it's like there's beautiful church after beautiful church. After a certain point, they all sort of look the same from the outside. But as you open the door and enter in, each church is unique to the builder. And you can go to like these beautiful ornate altars, and you can't, and like the stained glass windows, you can't look away from the beauty of God because you're in there experiencing it. And that's our role as a family in evangelization, discipleship. We're opening the door then to our life and inviting people into it because we have created a culture where we love Jesus and we share it together. And now we're using our gifts and charisms as a family to invite people into that.
So what does that look like? I mean, what does that look like for you then, I guess, to invite people into that? So you're just like living a life of love in the family, you know, striving to. But you're also talking about the Lord openly in the home. I think word and deed, both. What does that look like?
So I think it happens in 2 ways. So I always tell people, since the day I've been married, and it continues on, it's the closest I've ever been to heaven. Because I keep being formed, and I keep like having to let go of my own selfishness, and holiness is growing in me, whether I like it or not. So we're being formed in holiness so that when we're out in the world as lay people individually, like we're at work, we're in the world, we're at the coffee shop, whatever, we now are being formed into holier people to have encounters with people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I also think practically, like for us, my wife, like I'm introverted, my wife is super extroverted, and we have complementary gifts.
Yeah.
She is like amazing gift of hospitality. So we open the doors to our home and people come in and they feel the love of God because her gifts are being used, and they can see they're praying with my family, they're eating dinner with my family, they're, you know, experiencing the messiness and all that stuff of having 3 little kids. But I think literally by opening the doors and just welcome them into our home, people are experiencing the love of God and we see the love of God in them as well, you know?
Yeah.
So I think it kind of happens in two different ways.
Well, let's talk about this then. I love that, by the way. Let's talk about this. What are some practical ways of creating this like church, domestic church, like just with your family, like as a dad and with your wife and your children, whether they're single people listening, or, you know, they live in a home, maybe an apartment by themselves, or it's just a married couple, no children, or maybe, you know, married couple with children, little children or older children in the home. What does it look like to make your home? Like, what are some practical ways we can begin to make our homes like places of prayer? Like, I mean, what does that look like practically speaking?
Yeah, I actually have found that challenging.
Yeah.
Because you enter together as single folks who maybe have a rhythm of prayer in your life, and you have to figure it out, especially when you have young children.
Yeah.
So that it's an ongoing thing for us. But like when we talk about rooting ourselves in like rooting ourselves or being connected to the vine, that remains. But now it's you're doing it as like one unit.
Yeah, because I'm thinking too, like all the time, this needs to be the case. I think we need to strive as parents, especially as husbands and wives, to be praying together, to have this culture of prayer, discipleship in the home, and especially with our children. But especially now in this time of COVID,
Absolutely,
we can't necessarily always invite people into our home, and as we could, and hopefully we'll be able to again someday very soon. And maybe for some of us, we haven't been able to go to church, or it's still difficult to go to church because of all the restrictions and things like that. I mean, how do we facilitate this life of Christ, like just among our family?
Yeah, there's been a few ways for us. So since the beginning, Mary has played a humongous role in our life as a family. And so it started really from when we were dating until, wedding and all that stuff. And here we are now. So like just 3 days ago, we just finished, we every year try to do the consecration to Mary. And so like we consecrate our family, our lives.
Fantastic.
And we have seen like countless graces from that into our family. And each year we've offered our 3 children to Mary in the midst of that consecration. So we just finished. We have a youngest. We have our boy, Gus. We just did that for him. So that's been really unitive for us.
How old is he?
He's 2 now.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's been really unitive for us. The Hail Mary is a huge thing. Like our kids, like that's how every time we get in a long car trip, every night before bed, like that's been a unitive thing. Also getting into the rhythms of the liturgical season has been really good for us too. So like right now in Advent, we're doing the Jesse tree. That's a huge piece. We're lighting the Advent candle. They're making ornaments. We're reading the story of God's plan for salvation. So those things have been very practical ways for us to do that.
I like that. I think too, like the difficult thing for me has been like, well, I'm married for coming up on 3 years, basically 3 years now. We have a 9-month-old daughter, so she's not really participating in the prayer. But we're thinking a lot about it, especially now that we have a daughter and another one on the way, where we're like, okay, like what are we going to do? How are we going to have like family prayer exist? And I think, I over-idealize. I think it's easy to over-idealize what it's going to look like. Paige was just on a retreat, because we've always said we want to pray a rosary, or at least a decade, like as a family, or Paige and I, like at least once a week. For whatever reason, we struggle so much to do that. We have such a habit of our personal prayer, like on our own in the mornings or in the evenings, but we've had such a difficult time of like having these communal family prayers. And this director that was meeting with Paige just suggested, you should just pray it. Doesn't matter how like reverent it is or how pious you think it ought to be.
It's great advice.
You should just pray it while you're doing stuff. If Emma's crying, if Emma's walking around, just keep praying it. I mean, that's the beauty of some of these rote prayers and these liturgical prayers that we can do in the home, is that they kind of have a flow to them. And sure, maybe we would like for them to be like, I know sometimes I'd like for them to be more prayerful and silent, but that's not necessarily just the life of a family. So I think finding like little practical ways of praying together as a family. My brother Ben, who has 5 kids, and they're trying to do like nighttime prayer together, and that can be challenged, and kids are crying and kids are, screaming or whatever. It's really difficult to kind of have like this really intentional time of prayer. He's mentioned something as simple as like, lighting a candle. Like when he lights a candle, that like captivates
that's
his
great.
kids.
That's great.
And then they're open to anything. When they get to light this candle, And like that's a cool like liturgical like practice of allowing your wife and your kids to kind of enter into prayer. That's what my wife and I have been trying to do. Like with this space, we're recording in here right now, but we've been trying to make this space like a little bit more of a space for prayer. It's just this little loft we have in our house. And so like with the bookshelves, I don't know if this camera can see or that camera can see, but we have like an icon of the Holy Family. We've got some candles, have a little incense burner, we can light incense and things like that. But yeah, I think maybe that's one other tip, is having like a space.
I totally affirm that. That's been huge for us too.
Yeah.
So before we ran out of room, we used to have a whole room dedicated. It was a prayer space, like a little chapel, and that was profoundly impactful. We were able to bring the kids in there, and I think that's huge. The candle thing, I love that. That's so good. That's so good. We've seen the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I recommended my brother Ben. I said, I have this incense thing. It's a tiny little,
I was hoping you were going to light
coal.
it today, but
Well,
whatever.
it fogs up the camera. Otherwise, I would have. And I said maybe that's another. So I think my brother Ben's going to get that as well.
That's
to
cool.
light the incense, like to do that as part of the prayer with the family. But yeah, I mean, having a sacred space, like in our home, of course, is a place to pray, but it's a place to play.
Yep.
As well.
Yep.
And so there's a good balance of rest and of mission and of prayer and all these things. But if you have a space set aside in your home, like a little oratory for your home, a little altar in your home, it's just consecrated as a place, as a holy place within the context of your home. That I think just can be a helpful tool for a family to enter into prayer. You know, my wife and I sit here and we look at the icon or we light the incense. It makes it easier to enter into like liturgy of the hours, night prayer, to like pray something like that together. This is why we do liturgy in the church at all.
Yep.
You know, it's these things we do with our body and these things we look at that help us to enter into.
It's the beauty of Catholicism. I mean, honestly,
100%.
the tangible nature of the faith is so good.
Yeah. And I think in the home that we can find little ways to do that. And like your Jesse tree thing, of course, it's not something you do all the time, but it's a seasonal way and a tangible way of helping your kids kind of enter into this season of Advent as we prepare for the coming of Christ.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, maybe let's just finish this last part about talking about the family, about the role of the dad or the role of the husband as the spiritual head. I think maybe that rubs people the wrong way at times, but it is scriptural, right? St. Paul says really clearly that the husband is the head of his wife, that the wife ought to submit to her husband. This was a reading, at the church. And of course, husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up, right? So we husbands should in return sacrifice their life for the sake of their wife and for the sake of their family. But that being said, I think so often missing in our homes is real masculine, fatherly, spiritual leadership. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the importance of a father, of a husband and a father, of being a spiritual leader to some capacity in the home. Maybe what's that look like for you? And
That's
like,
such
what
a
advice
good
would
question.
you have for
That's
some
such
men?
a good question, because this has been a beautiful learning experience for me to just. It has shown me, it's given me new eyes to see God in a particular way, God the Father. I remember holding my daughter for the first time, and it was like all of these theological thoughts that I knew in my head just kind of came here finally. It was like, God is a father, and he loves me like he loves no one else. It's a very individual and specific love, and he's called me into that same love. And I felt that the first time I held my first kid, and every subsequent child after that. It's like, I love this child like I could love nobody else in the world. So that is there first and foremost. But I think as a father, in a particular way, one thing that has stuck out to me is that I feel now as a father that I am almost like the gatekeeper to grace in my family. I feel as if how I am living in communion with Jesus, it is like the grace is sort of poured down over my family. So if there are the tough spots in my life where maybe I'm staying away from prayer or whatever it may be, I think I've tangibly seen. I've never said this to anybody. I've tangibly seen that effect on my family, because like I'm the spiritual gatekeeper of my family. It's because this is God's call it's to be that. So like that constant call, I think, to continue to pray for my family, to fast for my family, and to be that sort of strong foundation spiritually for my family. I have felt that in a really authentic way, in ways that I never really expected, to be honest. And it's been really beautiful and really challenging, to be honest. And I think, you talk about that quote from Ephesians that I think is a beautiful mystery of the faith, but also can struggle with that. But as I referenced my wife earlier, the complementarity of our even just the natural gifts we've been given, but I also see it in sort of the spiritual gifts we've been given. She truly is the heart of our home. Yeah. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, and I know we were talking about the quote.
Yeah.
And I think you should share it when I'm finished. But I think like that's where like she's the heartbeat of our domestic church.
Yeah.
And it's because of how she was created. Like
Yeah.
the masculine and feminine complementarity is very real.
Yeah, 100%. I was listening again to Dr. Scott Hahn.
Mm-hmm.
He's had this conversation with Matt Fradd and Matt Fradd's podcast, Pints with Aquinas. And I thought that it's the best like explanation of understanding Ephesians 5, the husband as the head of the house that I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
He says he's drawing from Pius XII and Augustine even, in saying that if the father is the head, which is true, it's even more true that the wife then must be the heart. And he says that any authority that we have, like even when Jesus says, your authority will not be like that of the pagans. You won't, lord it over people, but you're called to serve. And so any authority, he says, should be directed towards love. Authority itself is not an end. It's a means to an end. And the end is love, which is kind of the foundation of what we're talking about here in evangelization. The end is love. And so if a husband is going to be a good spiritual head of the household, things tend to go well if he defers to the heart. If he reverences the heart, if he lifts up, if he's the king, then the wife is the queen. And I think a home goes well if children see their if children see their father, the husband, reverencing his wife and honoring his wife and being obedient to his wife. So I think that's just a great interplay.
That's beautiful.
That in Scott Hahn says, and I've noticed this in my own wife, like Scott Hahn says his wife takes his knowledge and she turns it into wisdom.
Ooh.
And I think I've noticed that in my own life. I have never gone wrong, I feel like, in deferring to my wife. When it's not things about right and wrong, but it's prudential judgments that we're trying to do as a family. When I've deferred to her, things seem to be right in the home and seem to be right in our
That's
marriage
beautiful.
and right in our relationship.
Beautiful.
So I think that's something else for men to consider. I mean, that's how you lay down your life for your wife is you listen to her. You're obedient to her. So it's not this domineering kind of head.
Right, absolutely.
Headship,
right.
But it's this headship that is attentive to the heart. So I think that's awesome. I think that's a beautiful way. One other thing that I would say for men that I just have such a heart for is that being a Christian, being a Catholic is not just for women. It's not a feminine thing alone, right? It's also very masculine. Christ is masculine. And men have a duty to, as they lead the family, to allow the word of Christ to dwell in them richly. We started with this in prayer, and I want to read this passage, and I think it's important for all of us, but in a particular way, I mean, as we're talking right now, for men, I think to take this passage to heart. St. Paul says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as you teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." So I think men can't be good leaders of the family. Women can't be good leaders of the family if they are not abiding in the word of Christ daily, often. There's no way we're going to create a culture of evangelization and discipleship in the homes if we are not allowing the word of Christ to dwell in us richly. So I think that just comes back to, again, like setting aside time. We set aside time every day. We're called to personally, individually, to sit with the Father. But we have to figure out how we set aside time as a family to pray together in the home, but also in our parish.
Absolutely.
Not only in the home, but entering into the parish. The parish is the ordinary place that families come together, and we'll get into this in just a second. But I think it's the ordinary place for families. It's a family of families, essentially, the parish is. So it's an ordinary place for families to go to be nourished, to receive sacraments as a family, to go to confession often as a family, to go to Mass often as a family. And so, yes, we have these set-aside places and times in our homes to create this culture, but we also have to have these set-aside times where we go to church. We leave the home and we go to this sacred space that is consecrated to also worship and to receive the grace of Christ as a family. So that's the parish. And I think maybe
great segue.
That's a great segue into talking about the role of the parish
in
evangelization and discipleship.
So you just mentioned
Yeah.
kind of the etymology of the word parish. You talked about a home among homes or a house among houses.
Yeah.
That to me is such beautiful imagery when we talk about the parish. It's also rooted, which I didn't know until I did a little more research on this, rooted in the word sojourner, like a traveler. And when I think about
Really?
that, yeah, in connection to family life, to evangelization, discipleship, to just being here on earth, moving towards our time in eternity. Pilgrims. You think about it. Isn't that cool?
So that's the etymology. It has that kind of sojourner term, and then also like a home or
A house among houses.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you sort of mentioned that, like a family among
I didn't know
families.
that's what the word parish meant.
Yeah,
I just,
yeah.
Okay.
So to me, those two things are great
Okay.
examples of why we need to talk about this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
because I think it can lose its meaning.
Right.
And if you break those two things down, again, we're coming from families. Like you talk
Okay.
about that Mother Teresa quote at the beginning of
Yeah.
our conversation. We go love our family first, and
Yep.
then we go out there and
Yep.
love others. But we come together as families. So like it's this house among houses where we're coming
Yeah.
together to be fed, to be sent out, to to get to know the Lord in a more intimate way, to see
Right.
witness of others so that we can be better witnesses. But also
Yeah.
we are journeying together literally to heaven. We
Yeah.
are moving to our eternal home, and that's
Right.
what a parish does for us. It's there as a place where we can come and be fed and,
Yeah.
and build ourselves up to be able to go out so that we can find ourselves home.
So it's essential then that parishes become these hubs
Have
of,
to be.
of evangelization
They
and
have to be.
discipleship. They become what is that in the new directory for catechesis, that it talks about the parish being the ordinary place?
Yes, I think so.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's what we were just reading that
Yeah,
book together.
right.
Yeah, and I think that's really true. Of course, it's a home of homes.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
A house
It's a
among
family,
houses.
Yeah, house among houses, a family of families,
Mm-hmm.
and so that it needs to be a place for where discipleship and evangelization are normal.
Mm-hmm.
Those are ordinary. And but for that to happen, there needs to be a culture of evangelization and discipleship. Sadly, when I go to many parishes, and this isn't a knock on anybody,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's the reality. My experience has been parishes are not real places of community.
Mm-hmm.
They're not real places of evangelization and discipleship. I think they're a place, of course, where we go to Mass and we receive the great gift of the Eucharist. We receive the great gift of the sacraments. All that is good, but I think often missing is this really living sense of discipleship
Mm-hmm.
and evangelization
Mm-hmm.
at the parish. Have you seen that? Have you seen anything else?
Yeah, I think where we are, again, I think if we kind of see where we are in the history of the church and the history of the world, I just want to affirm how vital it is
Okay.
for the parish
Yeah.
to become exactly that, because
Right.
that's the gift of a congregation. That's the gift, really, of the church
Mm-hmm.
in her wisdom, is to have these homes among homes, these communities that are focal points in our neighborhoods. We need a place to begin,
Yeah.
and for it to be a usual place, we need to begin to actually do it.
Right.
And I think oftentimes, you talk about culture, and culture really is like, that's the underlying way of how we
Huh.
do things. It's the collection of beliefs and thoughts, and it's how we do things.
Right.
And if we don't have something unitive in a culture, then it's just kind of just throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks.
Father Jonathan Meyer always, it's one of the quotes he loves, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
He loves it.
He shares that with me all
Yep,
the time.
yep.
But I mean, that's how true is that?
Yep. Because we
Culture
can
eats
have
strategy for
exactly,
breakfast.
we can have the most awesome programs ever, but those are kind of like the sapphires, you mentioned earlier. But without the diamond, without having like a real unitive vision for our life, I think that happens in our family. If we don't have a vision for our life, that family is meant to make us holy and get ourselves to heaven.
Right.
If we don't have that same vision for a parish, which is that this is a place for evangelization and discipleship, then we can just be spinning in circles until we die, and we don't want it to be like that.
If we have activity at our parishes, that doesn't necessarily translate into a culture
No.
of evangelization and discipleship.
In John's gospel, Jesus says, "You know you're my disciples by the fruit." And like we can have activities. This can
Yeah.
be true in our family and our parishes.
Yeah.
We have all kinds of cool looking things.
Right.
But if we step back and ask the question, is this bearing fruit?
Yeah.
And what is the fruit? Is that
Yeah.
more disciples are made, is that we have people growing in relationship with Jesus and
Right.
bringing people into that.
Right.
Then are we really living a culture of evangelization and discipleship in our communities? The answer is no.
Yeah. Sherry Waddell, I think, talks about more and more disciples. The presence of more and more disciples in the parish is what will change everything. And so that's the role. The parish has to have this role of making disciples who go out and make disciples. The parish has to have a role of equipping those lay people, the laity who are there, to evangelize by word and by deed. I think that's so important. Although when I say that out loud, I know that many people who are just normal mass goers, normal church goers, might balk at the idea that they have to be evangelists, that they have, I evangelize by the way I live my life, but I don't really need to talk about it. I think that quote that's attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, I don't know if you ever said it, is abused. Like,
Totally.
Preach the gospel at all time, but when necessary, use words.
Right.
I think as Catholics, we too often abuse that term, and to be like, I preach the gospel by my life, and then I don't really ever need to use words because my life is amazing, or something like that. Like I know my life is certainly not amazing enough that that's going to be the gospel for people at all. I hope that's the call in many ways, but nevertheless, there will always come a time when the witness of my life is not quite enough. There will always come a time where somebody wants to know a reason for the hope that's within me, the reason for the hope that they see in me, and that's an opportunity to share the faith. And the laity, I think the church has said, especially, has always said that the laity has a primary role in evangelization.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that to me, honestly, that why we can talk about where we struggle as a church, I think it's also my greatest sense of hope. And so I have two thoughts. When you talk about that ill-attributed quote to St. Francis, who I've been thinking a lot about this Advent is St. John the Baptist. And I'm going to be honest, for the longest time, I never really understood it. I'm like, how could people be attracted to this dude? Like, he's wearing a hair shirt, he's eating locusts. But I just, was meditating on the scripture with my small group last week, and we started talking about it. And the point was like, he essentially planted a church in the desert, and people came to him. Like it said, all of Judea and all of Jerusalem came to him in the desert to see what this guy was about. So he was witnessing, like his life was a witness. And people were attracted first to the witness of his life. But then he didn't just leave them there. Like, he proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ to them while they were there. And that's what changed their life. So there has to be a both and. It can't just be, okay, my life's a witness. It's a both and situation,
100%.
And I think, again, going back to the hope I see in the church is that as Christians and as Catholics, we were baptized and confirmed in the Holy Spirit. And with that came gifts and charisms and like a mandate to bring those gifts and charisms into the world as a witness to the love of Jesus. And so the thought that I think about often strategically as a person who works in ministry is like, I see this like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, souls, whose gifts and charisms are just waiting to be invited back into use, waiting to become undormant. Ignited. And that's the role of the layperson in the church, is that you and I and every other layperson, baptized and confirmed, were given gifts. And if we trust that the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit and that they will work signs and wonders in our lives, then the church will be lit ablaze. And I think that's our role as lay people, is to call each other into that. And,
I've heard it said somewhere, like, I don't know who I've heard say this, but I like the thought, like, the Catholic Church, I'm looking at it in the United States at least, has already kind of done the church planning. There's like a really big thing right now in the evangelical Christian world to like plant churches, and you have this one church with multiple locations. Sounds a little bit like Catholicism, but you have this one church with multiple locations, and like, Traders Point is a church here in Indy that's doing that, and where they grow and they start putting churches in different geographical areas with the goal that church will be a place of evangelization to not only just the context of their building, but the context of that whole area. That's why they plant a church there. But the Catholic Church is set up as such that parishes make up a geographical area, and we cover the whole United States with parishes. So in that sense, we are placed, the Catholic Church is placed strategically in a way to be places of evangelization and discipleship,
right.
to evangelize the whole country, to evangelize all these areas. And so, yeah, I mean, this comes back to just, it is essential that our parishes are cultures of evangelization and discipleship. They are places where parishes equip lay people to evangelize. Parishes don't just ask, like, how do I get more people out there to come into the church? Because the reality is that's not really happening. But instead, flip that question and ask, how do we get the people in here to go out there and make disciples? How do we ignite the people, inspire these people to an encounter with the Lord, and then equip them with tools for evangelization so that they can go out in the home, in the workplace, in the neighborhood, and they will be the primary evangelists. I think that's the piece that's missing in the parishes, that essential focus on raising up lay people as leaders. And maybe let's just talk a little bit more into that, talk more about that now. So we talk about a culture, but how does this happen? Like, practically speaking, how does a parish create a culture of evangelization and discipleship?
Yeah, what's interesting, and we were talking about this before we started, that where we see the church around the world growing the most is in places that they're being persecuted. And I think the reason for that, one of the main reasons, is because they have to simplify the mission. They are living exactly in a way that Jesus left us as a church, Yeah. And I think for us now, that's kind of where we have to think about more of a simple vision for what a community should look like, a real authentic Christian community. It's rooted in love of Jesus and love of each other, And so, you talk about a little bit, I don't know the terminology you use, but the
Ministry of Training.
Ministry of Training,
oh,
yeah.
That's right. So I actually want to recommend this book. Yeah, The Lost Art of Disciple Making. This book called The Lost Art of Disciple Making. This guy, Leroy, I think either Ames or Imes, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I think on page 28, I got it in my notes, on page 28, he talks about how we often try to carry on and hand on, rightfully so, the ministry, Jesus' ministry of redemption, the gospel, that Christ came, that we were sinners, Christ loved us, and he came to save us of our sins, he died on the cross, he rose that we might have life in him, we might walk in newness of life in this life and into eternity. But we fail to look at how he went about sharing that message in the first place during his earthly ministry. And he calls that the ministry of training.
It's a very practical way to think about it. I think it's important. I think that speaks to the kind of the simplification of what is particularly a parish community could and should look like. I think this is Father Mike Schmidt's quote or statistic. I don't know if you want to call it a statistic, but he said that Jesus spent 85% of his ministry in a 5-mile radius.
Really?
Yeah. That to me is so profound to think about that. Yeah. He went community to community. He spoke to large groups, but he invested one small group at a time.
Yeah.
And that is where the growth is happening, is because it's, in a sense, is a ministry of training. Like Jesus is showing us that there is a methodology that we can get behind as a church.
Right.
He was a man of deep prayer, deep service, and then he invested his life in a very small amount of people, 12 people, and then 3 specific people, and Peter, James, and John.
Yeah, and of the disciples who are following him, he spends the night in prayer.
Yep.
Right? His interior life. Then from there, he calls his disciples to him, but of the disciples, he chooses 12, who he names apostles.
Yep.
And I think there's something there. And then he trains them.
Yep.
I mean, he does life with them. He invests his life in them, but he also trains them for the ministry. He trains them to share the ministry of redemption with the world so that they can do that. And I think that's a good question for a parish to ask. How are we training, or are we training at least a few people in our parish, a few lay people at a time, for evangelization?
Yep.
Are we spending time with them in formation and in training so that they can be effective evangelists in the world?
Absolutely. And that, to me, to get back to your question, that is what creates a culture of evangelization and discipleship. If everything is rooted towards that, pushed towards that, these awesome events that we have should be at service to the vision of this training. And if it's not, is it bearing fruit? So I think that's kind of, again, it goes back to creating a culture. Kind of starts with that. You have to create that vision.
So, I mean, what are some things that parishes could do to start doing this?
Yeah,
what could a parish do to have this ministry of training, to begin investing in a few, choosing to do, I love the saying, choose to do for a few what we would love to do for many.
Yeah, that's great.
And then carrying on that process. Like, what could a parish do? Maybe what are some ideas of some things they could do?
Well, I always encourage starting in prayer, and like very intentional prayer. I think a parish staff, anybody who works within the parish community, key volunteers, you start to pick a time once a week. You sit in front of the Lord and you start to ask Him, where is it that we're supposed to go? And who are the people that we should start investing in? I think you start there.
Yeah.
And then I think
I love that. I love the second question too.
Yeah.
Who are the people?
That's really the main thing.
I love that.
Who are the people that's going to start? Who's going to be the foundation? And then I think it's an honest assessment after that, or in the midst of that, what are the things that are actually pointing towards this vision of evangelization, discipleship, and what are the things that aren't? And then you have to prune. When Jesus talks about being connected to the vine. A vine dresser is someone who prunes things so that the plants can grow, so the fruit can grow. And so I think you start to assess, what are the programs, even into each detail of like, how do our greeters serve the mission of evangelization, discipleship? How does our wedding planner serve our vision of evangelization, discipleship? How does each program? How do the homilies? How do those folks who read at Mass? How do the folks who the liturgy directors? All of those things.
Do we have a plan? Yeah, I love the question. How does our parish make disciples?
Yep.
Do we even know?
That's a great.
Can we answer that question?
Yep.
Because often I don't know if we really can. I think we desire to make disciples, but we just do all sorts of things that are all good. But perhaps it's necessary to give up good things for the sake of something better.
Absolutely.
But to have our eyes fixed on, Jesus, and to have a plan in place. St. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that he doesn't shadow box, All the runners run the race, but only one wins the prize. Run so as to win. So it's essential, I think, as parishes that we don't just shadow box, do programs and programs and programs and programs with no real plan for how we are actually going about making disciples, that we're raising up a few people at a time at least, raising up people to be disciples and to hand on their faith to another. So I think, there are tons of opportunity. We want to equip laity so that they could witness their faith, share their faith in any moment, of course, of their life. But I think a parish has a responsibility to not just do things randomly. I think a parish has a responsibility to be intentional and streamlined in their plan for evangelization and discipleship, and so that things work together and there's a clear path, pathway for discipleship for people.
And I think oftentimes people will then not really challenge, but they'll come back and say, well, it's not like one size fits all. Like everybody can't just say, this is how we do it at every parish.
Yeah.
And I would completely agree. I mean, if it's rooted in what we talked about at the beginning, what evangelization discipleship really is, and you ask that question, does this program serve it? Do we as a parish do this thing? If we can start to answer those questions, then you see the uniqueness of your community come to life. You talked about how they're planted in different neighborhoods, and that's kind of what, like a parish truly is a mosaic of all these individual gifts and charisms. And then they're being fed, built up, sent out to then use these unique things. And that's what makes kind of a charism of the uniqueness of a parish community is found in the uniqueness of the individual gifts that are called to life in the communal church. Does that make sense? So
absolutely.
I really love that. I mean, those are foundational things that each community could do, really.
So, like, let's transition then maybe to what are some things that parishes. I want to reference this article we talked about before from the Evangelical Catholic. It's not a very long article, but it talks about some things that parishes are doing wrong for evangelization. And I think it's a funny title. I thought about titling the episode, just things the parishes are doing wrong.
Sure.
But I figured I'd be more charitable than that. But no, but I think it is charitable. I think that is charitable because it's pointing out like these common practices that we see in a lot of parishes that maybe aren't the most effective ways about going about creating cultures of evangelization and discipleship. I don't know if you have that with you, but maybe what are a couple from that article? What are a couple things that parishes may be doing like poorly or doing wrong for evangelization, and how could we shift the focus?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we started with, is that the constant discussion about evangelization and discipleship. I think Peter references like spending a whole bunch of time talking about a mission statement. He's like, but Jesus gave you the mission statement is to go and make disciples, you know? And that to me is a great place to start. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with creating a mission statement. Don't get me wrong, because again, there's a uniqueness to each parish community.
Yeah.
But the baseline of what we do as a parish community is to figure out how it is that we serve the mission of the gospel and evangelization discipleship. So that was one.
Right.
The other one he brought up was that
I like that one.
Yeah, parishes maybe can be afraid to get messy. And like he referenced a quote from Pope Francis about the church is meant to be messy. We're supposed to be getting in the mess of people's life. I was challenged once in my own work in ministry. I felt very clearly in prayer, like you're not living in people's brokenness enough to know how to serve them in their brokenness. So I was kind of getting comfortable with like, just here's what I do. And so that's a challenge. Like parish community life should be getting into the messiness, and that's what we referenced at the beginning, the messiness of loving each other. Like it can't be hiding behind a program. It's got to be a person at a time. So I think that's another thing that he references really well. So those two things are ones that I think about often when we think about parish life is mission. We've already got a mission.
Yeah.
It's how do we make the unique community focused on that mission, and then not being afraid to just get in people's lives and to love them.
I want to kind of finish with this quote. This is actually another quote from that book, The Lost Art of Disciple Making, and it's a quote that it's always just really stood out to me, and I think it's just maybe something that that our parishes could take to heart. But I think we can just take it to heart as just people, whether we're talking about creating culture of discipleship in the family, just in our own life. Just that our life is itself a culture of evangelization and discipleship, or in the parish. I think that this quote is helpful. And so he says, the ministry is to be carried on by people, not programs, by someone, not by something. Disciples cannot be mass-produced. We cannot drop people into a program and see disciples emerge at the end of the production line. It takes time to make disciples. It takes individual, personal attention. It takes hours of prayer, patience, and understanding to teach them how to feed and nourish their souls. And I would add, and how to hand that on to another as well. But yeah, I mean, it just comes back to evangelization and discipleship is fundamentally about people.
Yep.
And maybe just come back again, like with how you started, Matt, and just share again, maybe breaking down evangelization and discipleship. I think that might be a good way to close.
Yeah, I think we can reference our own lives.
Yeah.
I mean, it was people that invested in us. Like for me, I was born and baptized Catholic. I lived the life of a cultural Catholic, and that's great, good. But it wasn't until someone took the time to invest in me individually that I really felt a desire, and really my call as a layperson, to enter into real deep relationship with Jesus and the church and the mission of the church. And that's what it is. I mean, like we are here talking about the church because someone historically invested in a person, and that person invested in a few people, and that person invested in a few people. And it's a beautiful, simple way to think about it. Again, it brings us back to the root, the heart of all of this is being in love, in relationship, and sharing and inviting other people into that love and that relationship. And thank God for the people that have gone before us, and thank God for the people that invested in us so that we're here to be able to talk about it.
So I want to just basically leave people watching and listening maybe with this thought, this question. I think the next good step for anyone listening, and for us as well, Matt, you and I, is to ask the question, if you want to create a culture of discipleship in your home or in your parish or wherever, start with the question, who is the Lord placing in my life for me to invest in? Who is the Lord inviting me to invest in more intentionally, to begin walking with, to begin accompanying more so than I have been? I think that's just a good starting question to take your next good step. Who are the people in my life that I can be more intentional in handing on the faith? It's probably going to be your family, probably going to be people in your home. I would say it needs to be those people, but it might be one or two, three other people, three other men, three other women in your life who come to mind that you could reach out to, that you could invite to go to coffee, for a beer, and just begin talking about your life, talking about the Lord, and helping one another, continue to take your next good step towards Him.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Great way to close.
All right, everybody. So before we close, I want to just say once again, the active life is important in evangelization and discipleship, but even more so important is the life of prayer. And I know prayer can sometimes be difficult. It can be difficult to cultivate a habit of daily prayer in your life. So I just want to encourage you, though, to set aside time every day. If something that you're struggling with or you just want to grow in, I want to recommend the sponsor of this episode, Hallow. Hallow is a authentically Catholic prayer and meditation app. There's so many amazing ways to pray. It'll help you to cultivate a life or strengthen your life of prayer, which has to be the foundation for evangelization, has to be the foundation for discipleship. So check out the link in the description below, hallow.com/Sean Hussey. It's an amazing Catholic prayer and meditation app. That's hallow.com/Sean Hussey. All right, Matt. Thanks again so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to be with you.
It's been awesome, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Have a good day, everybody. God bless.